Aside from the oil change, the tires should be rotated every 8,000 kilometers. This ensures no cupping, even wear, longer tread life, and you save money. It's easy to do. Let's have a look. Okay, let's have a look at what some of the tools are that we require to do our rotation. We'll need a floor jack, some jack stands, a breaker bar, a torque wrench, 22mm lug nut socket, and some wheel chocks. There will be no parts required, and the torque wrench specs will be 130 foot-pounds for the lug nuts. Okay, before we do the DIY tire rotation, let's discuss the process first. As you see in this image, there is an overhead view of a Jeep Wrangler and its 5 tires. But some cars have 4 tires, or in the case of the Jeep, some Jeep owners only rotate 4 tires. If it's a 4-tire rotation, you would follow this pattern. Now I know that the arrows seem a little bit confusing, so let me just describe the pattern a little bit for you. In this image you can see that the 2 rear tires are the drive tires. When you're rotating in a 4-wheel pattern, the 2 drive tires are moved to the front. Then the 2 front tires are crisscrossed and sent to the back. And that's why you have this diagram to illustrate 4-tire rotation pattern. Now looking at this image of a Jeep Wrangler with a spare, we have the diagram of the 5-wheel rotation pattern. Although it does look a little complicated, I'll simplify the explanation. You start with your spare, and it's to go to the rear passenger tire. So you remove the spare, remove the rear passenger tire, and then just install the spare onto the rear passenger. And in that case, you only need to raise one corner of the Jeep up because you're just dealing with one tire at a time. Then you take the tire that you just removed, and it has to be moved up to the front. So you remove the passenger front tire and install the rear passenger tire to the front. Then you take the tire you just removed and you crisscross the pattern and you put it in the rear driver's side. So you remove the rear driver's side tire and install the front passenger tire in the place of the rear driver's tire. Then you take the tire that you just removed, and that has to be moved up to the front. So you remove the front driver's tire and install the rear driver's tire in its place. Now that last tire that you removed would normally crisscross to the back tire, but because we just installed the spare there, this last tire will now take the place of the spare and take a break from the rotation. And so this is the diagram that explains the 5-tire rotation. This diagram shows the two so you can see the similarities. The only difference is with the spare, you have that little red arrow indicating that the last tire you remove goes to the location of the spare as the last step. I would now just like to point out one little thing, that some tires are called directional tires and they have an arrow on the tire indicating the direction to which that tire is to spin. So when you're putting a tire on the passenger side, you have to put the tires that have the arrow pointing in a clockwise direction on those rims. And likewise, you would have to get tires with the directional arrow pointing in a counterclockwise direction, or they should be mounted on the rim that way so that when they're installed, they will be turning in the direction that the Jeep is moving. And that explains why when you have directional tires, you do not involve a spare, because a spare wouldn't be able to satisfy both sides of the equation here. So this is the pattern that would describe the rotation pattern when you are using directional tires. The back tires move to the front tires move to the back. So we've talked about directional tire rotation, rear wheel drive 4-tire rotation, and 4-wheel drive 5-tire rotation. This is the diagram of the directional tire rotation, that's the diagram of the 4-tire rotation, and that's the diagram of the 5-tire rotation. These are the 2 diagrams that I follow because my winter tires are Bridgestones, and a lot of Jeep owners put winter tires on their Jeeps, and the rotational pattern is explained in that diagram. And the 4-wheel drive 5-tire rotation on the right is what I use when I rotate my summer tires. Now these diagrams and a written explanation are available on the website. You just have to click on the articles tab. Okay, without further ado, let's get started with the DIY tire rotation with amateur tips video. Okay, as we get started, the first thing we want to do is apply our emergency brake so that we keep the Jeep in place. And then of course we will put the wheel chocks under the wheel to keep the Jeep in place, and I've got them on the other side of the Jeep now as I'm filming the tire rotation on this side of the Jeep. Here I'm jacking up the Jeep by putting the floor jack just under the frame. Now before I raise the tire off the ground, I make sure to loosen the lug nuts before the tire gets completely off the ground. If I didn't do that, the tire would just spin on me. It's not a concern for the rear tire because the emergency brake is on. And I use the breaker bar to make the lug nuts loose. Now here I'm putting the jack stand nearby. You'll notice the plywood so I don't wreck my driveway. And once the tire is off the ground, I position the jack stand underneath. And then carefully lower the jack so that the Jeep's frame is resting on the jack stand. I prefer the floor jacks because it makes the process much more efficient than the scissor jack that comes equipped with the Jeep. And here I'm raising the Jeep from the axle. And then I'm going to put a jack stand underneath the frame, and I'm going to leave the floor jack in place as well, just for extra insurance. And now you just remove the 5 lug nuts from each tire. And there you see that I'm inspecting the brakes, but I'll explain more about that in our next video. So make sure you subscribe and click the alert bell so you don't miss it. Once the tires have been removed, you switch their positions. Given that these are rotational ones, the rear tires move to the front was moved to the back, and then you hand tighten the lug nuts. And then do the same for the rear tire. Now at this point I'm putting away my breaker bar and getting the torque wrench, and you can see I'm setting the 130 pound setting on the torque wrench. Now before I continue the video, I just want to explain the pattern that you should follow when you tighten the lug nuts. After you snug all the lug nuts into place, you'll tighten them in the following pattern. You start at one lug nut and then crisscross across the hub to the opposite lug nut, and then crisscross across the hub to another one, and again, and again, and then you're back to where you started. So here it is again. You would go in a clockwise direction across the hub, then do it again, and cross the hub to the next one, and then cross the hub to the next one, and then back to where you started. So you can see where there's the star pattern there. If that's too confusing, you just go in a clockwise direction every other lug nut. And after you do that, by the 5th lug nut, you're back to where you started. So there I am going around and just getting them all snug before I do the final torquing of those lug nuts. And if you listen, you could hear the clicking of the torque wrench. Now once that's done, you could lower that tire. Now what I'm doing is I'm lowering the front tire so that it is in contact with the driveway, so that as I tighten those lug nuts, the wheel doesn't spin. So you can see I didn't lower it enough there, so I'll just lower it a little bit more, and now it won't spin. And I snugly tighten the lug nuts, and once they are evenly snug, I will begin to tighten them to 130 foot-pounds, and you'll be able to hear the torque wrench clicking. You see the pattern there. And once you're done, you just lower the Jeep. Mission accomplished. And now it's time to put everything away. And congratulations, you have successfully done your winter tire rotation with directional tires. In fact, it's a little bit more difficult doing these tires because you have to have 2 wheels off at the same time to rotate them, whereas on the 5 tire rotation you only have to have 1 wheel off the ground at a time, because you always have the spare and then whichever tire you just removed to replace the wheel that's elevated. But here's a quick run through on how to do the 5 tire rotation. The spare comes off the Jeep to be mounted on the rear passenger side. We use the Jeep provided toolkit and use the hex key to take off the protective cover. Using your breaker bar, loosen the lug nuts. Here I'm using a 12-volt drill to speed up the process of removing the lug nuts, but be careful not to strip the threads. And now what you have to do is remove the rear passenger tire so that you could mount the tire that was on the spare. Then the tire that gets removed is moved up to the front driver's side. The tire at the front driver's side is removed, and the tire that was moved up to that location is installed. Now the tire that was removed on the front passenger side is moved crisscross to the rear driver's side. The tire on the rear driver's side is removed, and the tire that was moved into that spot is installed. And now you take the tire that you just removed and move it up to the front driver's side. The tire on the front driver's side is removed, and the tire moved up to that location is then installed. The tire that had been removed, instead of crisscrossing and being installed on the rear passenger side, due to the fact that this is a 5 tire rotation, is installed in the location of the spare. Tighten the lug nuts by hand. If you want to use a cordless drill to tighten them up quicker, remember to be careful not to strip the threads. Then set your torque wrench to 59 foot-pounds to make sure you tighten them according to spec. Remember to use the Jeep provided hex key to install the rear camera protector. So that's it. Congratulations, you've learned how to do a tire rotation in a few different ways for your Jeep Wrangler. We hope you found it helpful, because it certainly will help you save some money. Now let's take a look at some other money-saving tips in our tips segment of this episode. As we saw in the oil change video and this tire rotation video, we refer to torque specs when doing the job. But how do we remember what those values are? Well, in this week's tips segment, I'll show you how I access those values on my phone and on my computer. Stay tuned. Now for some cheaper Jeeper tips. Okay, let's first have a look here at the computer. It'll be easier to show you here. We'll just go to the browser and type in JL Wrangler Forums torque specs. And when you do that, you'll see a number of choices. We'll go to the top one, and I'll include this link in the description section below. It'll take you to this wonderful list of torque specs from all the different components of the Jeep, from the wheels and tires to things all the way up to the brakes. And when you click on the link there, you could go down the list and see all the different parts of the brakes and find the torque specs for what you're looking for. Like in our next video, we're going to look at brake caliper bolts, and there's the torque specs for that. So that's how easy it is to find it, and you would just bookmark that on your computer. And I do the same, as you can see here on my phone. I bookmarked the same website, and there it is in the top left hand corner. And you can scroll down, and there's the list of all the different elements of the Jeep that I could find torque specs for, and all the way from wheels and transmission. And there's the brakes up here. And then again, I could have the phone on me when I'm working on a job, and if I need to refresh my memory, I could just call it right up on my phone right here. So I hope that's a helpful tip for you to have ready access to torque specs when you're doing a job. And now for subscribers tips. So here's a tip from one of our subscribers. Hey Cheaper Jeeper TV, nice YouTube channel. Also, one thing when rotating your tires, make sure to torque the lugs again after 25 to 50 kilometers of driving, especially on alloy wheels. Signed, Gary. Hey Gary, thanks a lot. We appreciate the tip, and we'll make sure we incorporate that in our DIY videos. Hey, that's it for this week's Cheaper Jeeper TV, where we help you get the most for your money so you can get the most for your Jeep. We hope you enjoyed this week's video, and come back next week where we look at brake and fluid inspections. See you then.